Chapter 1 Ramsay. Long ago, Ramsay's boots were filled with icy water, and the howling winds drove sheets of stinging spray across his face as he struggled to keep his grip on the helm. He was fairly certain that the next wave was either going to capsize them or completely splinter their ship to matchwood. This, he thought with satisfaction, this is what being a pirate is all about. Wrenching at the ship's wheel with an effort that made his aching arms scream in protest, Ramsay leaned forward to bellow an order to his crew below. He might as well have been whispering, for the storm snatched at his commands and carried them away. No matter. Each of the crew was an experienced sailor, and the last few days sailing through what felt like literal hell had taught them to anticipate each order's actions, for now they would work without words. Ramsay squinted through the darkness and the rain to make out Rathbone and Mercia moving in tandem. They had lashed ropes to the railings and tied them securely around their waist as they wrestled with the sails, desperately seeking their ever-shifting balance that would keep the ship darting between the waves without the sails being torn to shreds. Behind them a flash of lightning illuminated Shan as he staggered up to the prow. He held a battered bucket in his hands and began emptying its contents overboard, bailing away rainwater that had trickled down into the lower decks. Those three pirates, along with Ramsay, represented the entire complement of the Magpie's Wing, the tiny ship he commissioned especially for this voyage. His friends and rivals had scoffed at the ideas of setting sail with such a tiny crew, least of all into the Devil's Shroud. But that was precisely why they failed where Ramsay had succeeded. The Devil's Shroud. Every pirate grew to know its name, even if they preyed upon waters 100 miles or more from that cursed region. Ramsay had never been a superstitious man, but you didn't have to believe in undersea gods or arcane rituals to experience the fog's effects for yourself, and learn swiftly that it was a very real threat indeed. The shroud ebbed and flowed across a vast region of the sea, writhing like a living thing. Unwary ships could easily be drawn into its fringes, even if they'd sail that route without incident for years. Any vessel that did slip in its course and find itself in those strange ethereal clouds would soon realize it, for its crew would begin to taste an odd tang upon the air, not quite sour and not quite rotten, but cloying on the tongue and in the back of the throat. It was like trying to take a deep gulp of black treacle. Ramsay mused, but a treacle that soon began to burn cold like a hand held too long in ice. Mask and scarves across the face would do nothing to help, and before long once-abled seamen would be coughing and sputtering, choking on the very air around them. Often they'd be so overcome that they wouldn't realize their ship was dying too. Whatever fell curse the region inflicted upon people foolish enough to enter would also work upon its wood and metal. Beams would begin to split and twist, buckling and warping the planks that made up the ship's hull. The nails that held them in place would start to rust away to a fine red powder. The beleaguered crew would be fighting a losing battle against an onslaught of leaks and breaches as murky water poured in below decks, new ruptures appearing faster than the old ones could be repaired. Yes, any seafarer with a promising career and a decent life expectancy soon learned not to sneer at the existence or the threat of the Devil's Shroud. Though the challenge just made each ambitious pirate all the more determined to see what was on the other side. Ramsay had hardly been the first to dream of the uncharted waters, encircled by those malevolent mist. Imagining an oasis at the center, like the eye of the storm, that would contain, well, anything. Everyone had their own notions of what might lie beyond the veil, and the topic was a favorite talking point down fireside conversation or whenever drink had been shared. Fabulous riches usually featured heavily in people's imaginations, although long-lost civilizations, hoarding said fabulous riches, and exotic beasts which could be sold and captured for fabulous riches were also common. A few naysayers would dismiss the idea of there being anything behind the shroud at all, and they would be quickly jeered out of the conversation. It was far more fun to believe. Still, Ramsay had always been sure that until the day mankind learned to fly like the birds, dreaming would be the only way anyone would peek beyond the shroud. There had been so much to see and do in the wider world, so many places to plunder and battles to be fought, that he'd been content to leave the mystery unsolved, unsolved and largely unheeded for many years. Until one day, he crossed paths with Mercia. "You're blocking me light," the pirate said curtly. Ramsay shifted apologetically as the pirate Mercia glanced up in irritation. The library in which they met barely seemed able to accommodate a tall and imposing pirate like Ramsay. He felt distinctly out of place in the serious and musty building, with his unkempt hair and tied back using scraps of cloth, and a bristly beard that made him seem older than his years. His seafarer's garb, breeches, a rough linen shirt, and a bulky greatcoat topped with a wide-brimmed hat only served to make him more incongruous among the crowded shelves. Now, well into his third decade, Ramsay had accumulated quite a bit of heft from the fine dining that success could offer. Thanks to the rigors of a life at sea, it was still mostly muscle, and he aimed to keep it that way for as long as possible. Squeezing himself on the bench opposite Mercia, though he found himself wishing he were a smaller man. His elbow brushed against a stack of books, nearly scattering them. He apologetically clamped a sustained hand down on the pile. "Now you're spoiling my work," Mercia sighed. "It's Captain Ramsay, isn't it? You got quite the reputation around here." "All of it deserved, I assure you," Ramsay grinned. Mercia did not. "You're an exceptional pirate yourself, I hear," he continued, beguilingly. "One with a lot of books and some curious ideas." "Curiosity is correct," Mercia replied, considering Ramsay for a moment as if debating how much time to spend indulging him. "And I don't just mean poking my nose into other people's treasure. We've all seen things out there we couldn't explain. Well, some of us want answers, and we have ways of finding them out." Ramsay frowned. "Alchemy," he ventured. "Natural philosophy," Mercia said patiently. "It's a way of approaching what you don't understand, solving mysteries like," one gloved hand waved vaguely, "why does a compass point north? Who built the old temples you find sometimes, and why? What precisely is the Devil's Shroud? Some people say it's a form of magic, as if that were any explanation. But I have another idea." Mercia began to speak at length of the mysterious fog, and the means by which one might chart its boundaries, and Ramsay sensed his own interest in the barrier rekindling. He felt some measure of shame at this. For the last few years had been very kind to him, bringing him a wife and 2 children. The black diamond ring upon his finger was a symbol of the promise he made to his beloved to one day provide her with all she deserved. Mercy had paused, and Ramsay realized he was expected to contribute to the conversation.
"Truth be told," he admitted, "things are getting a bit too familiar around here. The same old taverns, stories. I can parrot word for word. Finding a way through the shroud now, that would be an adventure to stick in the mind. Think you're man enough for the job?"
He'd chosen the words deliberately, and Mercia's eyes flashed in provocation. "We'll need charts," Mercia shot back with no hesitation. "Calendars, too. There's a shop in town that has some I've had my eye on. Smaller craft to use as scouts. Oh, and a ship, of course. She'll have to be swift and nimble, but rough."
"I don't understand half of what you've told me tonight,"
Ramsay admitted with a toothy smile.
"But rest assured, I know what makes a fine ship. You'll be aboard her when we sail?"
Mercia smiled back for the first time. "Just you try leaving without me." They had the Magpie's wing built in secret, a craft tiny enough to thread its way through the twisting routes where a ship might sail in safety. Together, Ramsay, Mercia, Sean, and Rathbone had stuffed the hold with floats and coracles to send out ahead in stout wooden planks to patch up any damage they might take on their journey. They packed their provisions and made their final preparations until there were no more reasons to delay. All that remained was Ramsay's choice: to stay at home with his family, or sail headlong into the unknown and be the first man alive to see beyond the Devil's Shroud. The call of the sea claimed him as it always did, and perhaps as it always would. The course they plotted was contorted, and the ship was forced to travel at a variable snail's pace. Finally, after days of inching their way through the stifling fog, starved of both food and sleep, they emerged into chaos. The shroud had released its grip on Ramsay and his crew, only to spit them into the heart of a massive storm. With no idea where land might lie, and no possibility of reversing course, They had no choice but to press on into the downpour. Another bolt of lightning, this one much closer, snapped Ramsay out of his reverie. They'd been lucky so far, able to angle through the waves without broaching, and only taking minor damage to the hull. But their good fortune would only last so long. The magpie's wing needed shelter soon. Feeling a tug at his shoulder, Ramsay whipped around to find Shan at his side. Even though the man was clearly bellowing, Ramsay had to bring their heads together practically to hear what he was saying. Lamb? Land! Shan shouted again. Eyes widening, Ramsay gestured impatiently and followed Shan's outstretched finger. There was something there all right, a dark and craggy silhouette that he could barely pick out against the backdrop of the raging monsoon. The ship gave a protesting creak as the captain spun the wheel once more, angling the bow towards the distant rock face. Shan picked his way down to where Rathbone and Mercia, both sodden and exhausted, were still fighting to capture the wind within the sails. Rathbone in particular seemed dead on his feet, despite being the brawniest of the three, and he gratefully relinquished his position to Shan. "Never thought I'd be glad to accept bailing duty," he barked over the cacophony, but he'd barely filled a bucket before he paused to sail, mortified at the horizon. "Ramsay has seen those cliffs we're headed towards, hasn't he? The cliffs that no one in their right mind would ever take us anywhere near?" Shan pretended not to hear him, and continued to wrestle gamely with the billowing cloth overhead, but Mercia snapped, "I'm sure Captain Ramsay knows exactly what he's doing," before giving the sail a particularly vicious tug. While Mercia's relationship with Rathbone had been civil by and large, he was proving a hard man to get to know. He was clearly a consummate pirate, despite possessing a clipped English accent more suited to an officer of the Navy. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his shoulders were broad, and his head was shorn to reveal a scar or two. Out of all the crew, he was most facetious about his appearance, and had come aboard laden with fine cotton shirts and gleaming shoes. Rathbone made a point of shaving every day, and took every opportunity to trim and tidy himself. Mercia wondered if Ramsay knew more about the man and resolved to ask, assuming any of them survived the night. More rocks were visible now, and the ship seemed to be sailing between two rows of stone columns that jutted out of the water like rows and huge teeth. Lifeless and sheer, they rose up on either side of the magpie's wing. Rathbone suspected he could almost reach out and touch the stone as the ship bobbed wildly on the waves. "He's gone mad!" Rathbone yelled, though Mercia's only response was to fully furl the sails, leaving nothing but their momentum to carry them forward. The looming darkness was almost upon them now, closer and closer still. Rathbone braced himself to hear the prow snap against the cliffs and feel the deck lurch beneath his feet. Suddenly, there was no more rain pounding down on them, and Rathbone found that he could hear things again, as Ramsay's call for light cut through the air. It took a crew a few moments to obey, groping for the ship's lanterns in the dark, with their frozen and fumbling fingers. But one by one, the flickering flames sprang into being and cast pools of orange of light across their surroundings. The feeble fire was like a summer sun compared to the darkness they'd sail through, and more than bright enough to reveal the truth of their whereabouts. The magpie's wing had sailed through a crack in the cliff face and was now drifting through a large cave filled with seawater, moving lazily toward the far wall. They dropped anchor at once, bringing the ship to a full stop, took in their surroundings as Ramsay moved down to stand with them. The walls of the cavern were slick from the spray of the sea, and the dark sandy brown rock was peppered with smaller exits and pathways, save for the view to starboard, which offered an unobstructed view of a wind-swept shore and a turbulent ocean behind it. The walls extended upward to form a series of high archways, a ceiling of sorts that provided protection from the storm. There were gaps overhead, through which vegetation hung down and the sluicing rain cascaded in a series of miniature waterfalls. The nearest was just a few feet away, and Shan carefully hooked a bucket onto a long pole and filled it to the brim with fresh water. One by one, they filled their flask and drank deeply in mute appreciation, till Shan, ever cheerful, broke the silence. "Funny how you only ever realize you're hungry when you've stopped being thirsty," he mused. "Are we sure there's no food left?" "Never mind your stomach," Mercy admonished. "Getting warm and dry is much more important." "Easy for you to say, it's not your stomach." Ramsay drained the last of his fat flask and stretched.
We can burn the floats if they'll take. Let's start a fire. It won't do good if we all get sick. Then we'll see what we have to celebrate with, eh? We're wet, but we'll dry out. We're hungry, but we'll find food. Today we four have made it through the Devil's Shroud. If that doesn't call for a belly full of grog, then nothing ever will.
The last remark earned a cheer, albeit an exhausted one, which rang around the cavern for a moment as all four roused themselves and went to work. The magpie's wing was eased carefully nearer to land until she could be close enough to a rocky outcropping that the gangplank could be extended. A circle of rocks was fashioned far from the reach of the storm, although finding wood dry enough to do more than give off a thick smoke proved a challenge. Rathbone's persistent use of flint and stone eventually yielded a cautious flame, and finally a hearty conflagration which all they were pleased to warm their hands. Shan disappeared off the ship wordlessly, though Ramsay knew the man well enough to know not to bother questioning his absence or his motives. Sure enough, his balding head poked back with a crevice in the rocks later, shining anew with fresh rainwater. "I've found a pathway that leads up to the higher reaches," he said, approaching his crewmates. Against his body he hugged both the motionless form of a scrawny rooster, as well as a few plump bananas. Shan offered the bananas to Mercia, whom he knew avoided meat with a disdain most pirates reserve for an honest day at work, and then set about cleaning and preparing the bird for its final resting place, a stained cooking pot that hung above their fire. Ramsay, who had busied himself filling several casks with yet more of the fresh rainwater, took the opportunity to study the man from afar and recall their first encounter. Every ship needs a quartermaster with a brain that can juggle 1,000 calculations at once, tallying every spilled pint of grog, every shot fired in anger, not to mention working out where the crew's next meal is coming from. Ramsay had no clue who might fulfill such a role on his voyage to the Devil's Shroud. But Shan had come recommended by Rowena, one of Ramsay's few close friends, despite the fact that she always kept her feet firmly on dry land. As the owner and proprietor of one of the largest and most dependably disreputable taverns on the coast, Rowena was the de facto matriarch of the town where she and Ramsay had grown up. They had played together as children. She introduced Ramsay to his wife, and he in return had used his earnings to help purchase the pub back when she was only its barmaid. When he told her of his plan to breach the Devil's Shroud, Rowena had promised to reserve his barstool for him, so long as he promised to come back in one piece. Rowena had also pointed Shan out across the crowded bar, a lithe and balding figure with a pronounced tan, a series of silver rings in one ear, and an intricate tattoo that ran down his arm. He was older than Ramsay, perhaps 50 or so, which was both unusual and impressive. Very few pirates lived long enough to ever think about retiring. What little hair he had left was already a snowy white. Dressed in a plain white tunic and simple knee-length breeches, carelessly barefooted, Shan might have also been mistaken for a novice deckhand were it not for the aura of calm that seemed to surround him. He presented a lone oasis of tranquility amid the hustle and bustle of raunchous enjoyment, while his fingers worked deftly and ceaselessly on something. Intrigued, Ramsay moved closer and wordlessly took a seat opposite, keen not to disturb the man in the middle of whatever creative whimsy had overtaken him. Watched with interest as toothpicks, carved wood, and scraps of cloth napkin were gradually whittled and tied to complete a tiny model pirate ship. Once the miniature vessel was finished to Shan's satisfaction, he painstakingly tied a loop of string around the mast and slid the little boat into a glass bottle. Only then did Shan give the string the lightest tug, hoisting the sails upright, and glance up at Ramsay for the first time. "You're thinking that it's good, but it's nothing extraordinary," he said conversationally, as if the two men had been chatting all evening. Ramsay merely grunted in response. Shan took a jug of water and, tilting the neck ever so slightly, filled the bottle and presented it for inspection. The little curio floated just fine, bobbing from side to side as the bottle was poked and prodded by a succession of inquisitive pirates. But it was the final bit of showmanship that convinced Ramsay. Shan placed another ship in its own bottle alongside the newly fashioned galleon, this one flying the colors of the merchant navy. Next, he pointed out the other string dangling from his latest creation and invited Ramsay to grasp it between two of his fingers and tug. Ramsay obliged. With a series of sharp cracking sounds, the miniature pirate ship let loose a volley from its diminutive cannons, unleashing pellets with such force that they escaped their bottle and pinged their way across the tavern's table and struck the merchant navy ship. Much to Shan's glee, Ramsay let out an audible bark of laughter upon spotting that the stricken navy vessel was already listing, taking down by the barrage of lead shot and sinking slowly toward the bottom of its own fractured bottle. "Welcome aboard," he said wryly before going on to introduce himself and explain the nature of the voyage. Shan didn't agree to a fateful journey into the shroud right away. Rather, he listened intently as Mercia's findings, at least the one Ramsay was willing to share in such a crowded venue, were laid out before him. He suggested a couple of modifications to the design of the magpie's wing too, but finally he grasped Ramsay's own paw in a wiry hand, clinked tankards, and asked when they'd be leaving. Since then, Shan meticulously rationed the grog and what food they'd been able to squeeze into the hold. He also insisted on diving under the ship while it was moving so that he could make improvements to her rudder control. He kept spirits up with the help of a gorgeous concertina. It was one of his personal possession, other than the unremarkable clothes he'd been wearing when he boarded. Watching Shan now as he tended to the roasting fowl, Ramsay felt a surge of gratitude towards Rowena for introducing them, and hoped he'd have the chance to repay her. Mercia gave a luxurious stretch, tossing the skin of her banana into the water with a loud splash that startled several fish out of their hiding places. Standing, she began to tug at the buckles of the greatcoat he'd been wearing since the start of the voyage, removing it and spreading its soggy bolt out by the fire to dry. His boots came next, but it was when he removed his tricorn cap and reached up for the pins that kept his long hair in place. He noticed Rathbone staring at him from across the fire. His face was a battleground torn between the twin expressions of fury and shock. Problem? Problem? Mercia asked, mildly shaking out curled tresses to settle around her shoulders. Her piercing sapphire eyes gleamed as she faced him down. Finally, the others could see her as Ramsay had come to know her. A fair young woman, with pale skin now framed by waves of blonde hair, whose stern demeanor and slender figure had served her well when seeking a life at sea. "All this time, your—" Rathbone's normally cold voice was rising in pitch with every syllable. "Drying out," she replied firmly, peeling heavy woolen socks away. "I've no desire to end up with trenched feet or a peg leg thanks to a pair of wet boots. You'd be wise to do the same." "I thought women weren't allowed on pirate ships," Rathbone whined, looking to Shan and Ramsay for confirmation and support. And finding neither. "Quite a lot of men do," Mercia said shortly, sliding a small dagger from her belt and using it to neatly slice a second banana. "In the same way, quite a lot of women think that male pirates are a bunch of superstitious, swaggering boers who don't pay nearly enough attention to what's past the end of their noses unless it tastes nice. But out here," the daggers glinted in the firelight as Mercia made a sweeping, dramatic gesture, "it's a fresh start. Medicines, maybe, and monsters too. The old legends have to come from somewhere, and it'll be waiting for anyone who's brave enough and bold enough to step up and take their share. Superstitions be damned." The blade stabbed downward, skewering a segment of banana, and Mercia popped it in her mouth with a fierce expression that indicated she considered the matter closed. Rathbone's mouth opened and closed a few times, causing him to resemble a gasping codfish, until he stood up swiftly and stomped away into the dim recesses of the cave, along the path that spiraled to the cliffs overhead. Only now did Ramsay approach the fire, secretly glad that Mercia had ended the conversation with her words and not her fist. While he figured she had every right to knock Rathbone flat on his back for blindly parroting the foolishness of his forefathers, it was just the four of them out here. The fewer broken noses, the better. Mercia was staring at her own reflection in the shining blade, but glanced up at Ramsay as lowered his bulk to sit behind her. "Think he'll be a problem?"
"I doubt it,"
Ramsay replied, accepting a bowl of hot, greasy meat from Shan.
"I've known Rathbone for a long time, and he's cunning enough to know a good crewmate when he sees one. He just doesn't like being left out of the loop, that's all. Did you mean what you said about monsters?"
Mercia shrugged. "Maybe. Why?"
"That doesn't seem very natural philosophy of you, that's all."
She scoffed at that. I'd be just as bad as Rathbone if I didn't leave an open mind. If we do find a sea monster, the second thing I'm going to do is learn everything I can about it.
Second, Ramsay stifled a belch. What's the first?
Slash at it with my sword until it stops trying to eat me. Mercia fastidiously oiled her dagger before returning it to its sheath. So now that we've finally made it through the shroud, what's next? Ramsay sucked the last of the hot fat from his fingers while he considered this.
We can't stay out here forever, he admitted. Sooner or later we'll need supplies that can't be foraged and a proper layover at an outpost. Ammunition maybe if this place really is as wild as we think. Until then we see everything we can, chart and note everything we can, take everything we can, and bury what we can't. Then we return home to tell our tales and become legends.
Mercia pulled a face, but deep down each of them felt the same flicker of pride. Recounting their adventures if and when they made it home would see them plied with drink for days, no doubt. One by one they shared their wild imaginations of what the next few weeks might have in store, talking through the night until the storm had blown itself out. Shafts of unfettered moonlight lanced through the ceiling and glittered on the water down below their camp as they spoke. When you've all finished daydreaming, Rathbone called out, his voice distant and reedy from high overhead, I think you're gonna want to come and take a look outside. Intrigued, the crew rose as one and moved, following Shan up the winding path he discovered earlier. They moved in single file as they ascended, pushing through damp leaves and leaving footprints in wet soil as they wound their way higher and higher. Rathbone, lantern in hand, was standing atop the island's highest peak, outlined against a speckled night sky that was dominated by a low and yellow moon. New stars, Rathbone said simply, and he was quite correct. Not one of them could spot familiar constellations or point towards Orion's belt. Even the North Star, brightest of all those distance lights, seemed to have different neighbors. Their compasses, at least, pointed the way as well as ever, but the implication was at once thrilling and disturbing. Wherever their journey had taken them, they could no longer rely on the constellation to guide the Magpie's wing in its voyage. From now on, they'd be sailing under unknown skies.